Hello, welcome to Free Kiwis. We have another video episode, and here today we are very delighted to have Steph Martin from the Free Speech Union,
And also from the New Zealand
also
Initiative.
from the New Zealand Initiative. Steph, welcome and congratulations. You are only the second person ever to be a repeat guest on Free Kiwis
Thank you.
after the great Elizabeth
The
Rata.
distinguished
I feel
professor.
very humbled.
So it's a great accolade. It's almost as
It is.
impressive as having a postgraduate degree in ancient history, which you also do. Which,
And
as we
being
know,
able to
is one of
read
the great performances
hieroglyphics,
of people.
which even our other classical scholar can't do.
That's right. Let's start by
Between us, we have ancient languages pretty
Pretty
That's
sorted.
right.
pretty
The
down
important
Well, I
pat,
don't know
right?
about Chinese. But
Well, sorry, yes, okay. No,
We'll work on that.
sorry.
In the meantime, what we're going to
That's
talk
true.
about today is actually two subjects relevant to free speech and academic freedom, or mainly free speech, I suppose. One is the new hate crime consultation paper from the Law Commission, and the other one is Victoria University of Wellington's revised free speech / academic freedom policy. They've had 2 or 3 goes at it already,
I think it's their second.
And just their second?
It's the second go at it, and spoiler, it's much improved, but we still have some concerns.
And we wrote an article a while back criticizing the previous iteration. So we'll talk about whether we think this one satisfies our complaints or whether we still have some complaints. But maybe we'll start out with this hate crime discussion paper. I printed out the Law Commission's summary of their consultation. I think you guys have actually read the whole consultation paper in full. So maybe the easiest way to start out is just, can either of you tell me what's going on here? What are they doing? Was there something in the past which addressed the same concerns? Is there already legislation on the books that has to do with hate crime, and what are they trying to shift to? That's the key.
Well, perhaps I'll kick off with that. So at the moment, if a crime is thought to be aggravated by hate, the judge can take that into account at sentencing. So there is an existing provision to take hate into account, but the proposal at the moment is to create a separate category of offence. So rather than the judge using hate as an aggravating factor at sentencing, somebody would be charged with a separate offence, say assault motivated by hate as opposed to just assault.
So certain crimes are themselves hate crimes per se.
That's right.
Yeah. Mostly, so at the moment we have crimes that then you may get a harsher penalty for if they decide that hatred was involved.
Yes.
And they want to move towards a situation where these two things are kind of bundled into a single package, and you have one sort of hate crime offense.
Steph,
consists of crime and hate together.
You've been doing some work for the free speech
union. Yeah. So just to give a little bit of context as well, what the Law Commission are doing here is something that has come out of the Royal Commission of Inquiry out of the mosque attack that happened in 2019 in Christchurch. And so the Royal Commission at that time made a number of recommendations of sort of things that they thought could be done in law and in other sort of social aspects as well to mitigate the possibility of similar sorts of events occurring in the future. And so one of the things that came out of that was a recommendation for the introduction of hate crimes. So what the Law Commission are essentially doing here is to take up that question of, is that something that needs to be done? And if we were to go about doing that, what might be some options for how we might do that? So this is not, I wouldn't say that this goes so far as the Law Commission recommending that we do. They're not that far along the process. At this point in time, what they're doing is they're sort of seeking submissions, seeking public feedback, and really I think the primary question that they're trying to answer at the moment is, do we have a problem that justifies the introduction of hate crimes in New Zealand?
Or do we have a problem that the introduction of hate crimes could address? I mean, it seems to me that the premise is pretty dubious, that somebody like Brenton Tarrant would have been deterred by the prospect of an even harsher sentence than life without parole, which is what he rightly has been given.
Well, exactly. And that could be one of our primary arguments against this, is that if the law's doing a good job and someone has committed a pretty heinous crime, they're going to,
I mean, in general,
they're going to suffer the
consequences. The harsher the penalties
already.
people are subject to, the less they commit that crime. That's an empirical finding. And not everyone's Brenton Tarrant, right? Because that's like an extreme crime. He's sort of extreme sort of psychopath, that guy, right? and he's
Yeah.
kind of going to do what he wants.
But this is
no
the
matter what.
this is the premise
But
of the
a lot
Royal
other people might
Commission
be
is
actually
that
deterred by harsher sentencing or by the hate crime being bundled into one package.
I suppose so. But if the premise was we could prevent further events like the mosque attacks, well, those
Right.
are always going to attract life without parole. And
Okay.
in New Zealand, we don't have the death penalty, so that's kind of
Right. So on this point, it says actually in the summary, the Royal Commission, this is the Royal Commission on the Christchurch Massacre. The Royal Commission recommended having hate crime offences for offensive behaviour or language, willful damage, intimidation, assault, arson, and intentional damage. However, this would not cover all hate crimes. So they're explicitly discussing what the Royal Commission recommended. I don't know if the implication is that, they're going to try and hit all those things that it names. If it is, I just want to flag this immediately. That bit at the beginning where it says possible hate crimes for offensive behavior or language. If you think about what a hate crime for offensive language involves, that to me would suggest hate speech, right? And we had the suggestion and the discussion of revised or new hate speech laws a few years ago.
yes.
And we wrote articles against that. Other people wrote articles against that. Chris Fafoy, who was then Justice Minister, did a disastrous interview trying to defend those laws. And I think the public overwhelmingly and rightfully rejected them. I'm a little bit worried that this might be a backdoor. Apart from the fact also that it's strange because we've been talking about how hate crimes involve some other crime and also hatred. And I'm just wondering if it's for offensive behavior or language, what's the other crime? You know what I mean?
Well,
If it's just offensive behavior.
There are already offences of offensive behaviour and offensive language,
like abuse or harassment.
Yes, if you shout certain words in public, you can be charged with offensive language. For example, if you call a police officer, effing C or something like that, you can indeed be charged. And offensive behaviour can cover a range of things that are kind of poor public behaviour. I think they're fairly loose categories, and we might have some
being drunk and disorderly.
That kind of thing.
And then you add hatred on top of that.
That's right. If you happen to be shouting, say, racial epithets or something like that. But, one thing for me is that it's pretty unclear why the status quo is substantively different to what they're proposing. I mean, I think there are some differences of process, and in some ways, I think having a separate category of crime is not as bad as putting it in the hands of judges to decide on aggravating factors at sentencing. So, for example, take the case of assault. At the moment, if somebody is charged with assault and convicted, then the judge can take into account the fact that that person perhaps attacked somebody who belonged to a minority and made it clear with what they yelled at that person while they were attacking them that it was motivated by hating that category of person. And then they might get a longer sentence. Under the proposal, instead, they would be charged with a different offence, which would be assault with hatred or something like that.
It would be a hate crime.
It would be a hate crime.
Yeah.
And then what would happen is that it would go to court and a jury, and the jury would have to decide whether the person had both committed the fundamental offence of assault and was motivated by hate in so doing. And if both of those elements couldn't be met, then the person couldn't be convicted. So to me, there's an argument that the sentencing provision is actually worse from a free speech perspective.
Do you think this kind of sets a higher bar to prosecute people for?
I'm no lawyer, but that's the way it looks to me when I read it.
Basically, if you have to convict someone on both hatred and the crime, that's harder to do than convicting someone for the crime of beating somebody up.
Yes.
And then later on, maybe at sentencing, it's taken into consideration.
And they may or may not get a harsher sentence, but they're going to get some sentence once they've been convicted of assault. So, yeah.
That's not quite my understanding of how it works. And this might be that I've misunderstood something here, but my understanding is that what they're talking about is what you're talking about actually itself being a hate crime. So it's not so much two kind of separate elements of the same thing. It's more that one thing is always a hate crime.
What one thing?
So, examples that we've talked about internationally are things like people doing like wheelies on rainbow crossings and things like this. That act itself is described as a hate crime. So it's not two sort of parts of one whole. It's that
Oh, I see.
that act is itself a hate crime.
So that actually extends the scope of this kind of legislation, right? Because previously
Yeah,
Quite,
okay.
quite,
you had to
quite
be
broadly,
committing a
yeah.
crime separately, and
Well,
then there was a hate element added to it. So is it the case that
It might be
hate
both of
crimes will
those things.
involve things which aren't already crimes without the element of hate? So, because for example, it's not usually a crime, as I understand it, to do a wheelie on a crossing, right? If it's just a black and white crossing, that's fine. Whereas it's always a crime to like beat someone up, right?
Yeah.
So what you're saying is, if it is seen as a hate crime, then to do that act, then that's actually going to be illegal, even though the sort of component act of it isn't illegal already.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
I would imagine, although in the Law Commission report itself, it does sort of say that they would only be looking at things that are already crimes. So that would suggest that we wouldn't have to be concerned about what you just described.
That's what I
But,
thought, but that example actually made me think that, yeah, it's true that some of the examples I've heard don't seem to involve
That's
things that are
true.
separately crime.
So I wonder if that example that I just gave wouldn't actually stack up
It's
to
great.
the Law Commission.
Well, this is the thing. I guess
It's a good thing to tease out,
yeah,
actually.
because it's kind of unclear to me at this point.
Yeah.
What were some of the other examples that you've been talking about? Do you remember off the top of your head? Throwing paint was one of them, I think.
Yeah.
So that's another act which it's not a crime on its own. It seems to me like that's the kind of thing that they might want to criminalize for just to,
It probably
act
is
of
a crime
expression, right?
to throw paint at somebody.
I suppose if you're throwing paint at like a painting in an art gallery, something that would be
That's
some kind of
vandalism.
criminal damage.
Yep.
And then if it had a hate element or was seen to have a hate element, then that would become a hate crime.
Yeah, my understanding is that basically they're looking at things that are already crimes and creating a separate category of offence where hate is purported to be involved.
That's what I thought too. So in a lot of ways, the change to me seems reasonably subtle, but they do actually. I will say actually that this document. I mean, I read the summary version, you read the full version, but I think you both agree with this. It is quite well written and it's quite fair. And I think that, for example, talking about Chris Fafoy, when they tried to introduce a new hate speech legislation a few years ago, I don't get the impression that that was very well done. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a politician, but as a citizen, I don't think that that was very tight. It wasn't very well presented. And I think this is, they've done a much better job here, and I can sense that they're a little bit more on the fence as well. It's quite a balanced argument.
Yeah, I get that sense very much too.
So one of the things Michael asked is, what's the difference between these two things? In what sense is it an improvement? In what sense is it maybe a deterioration or worsening? And why do we need this new legislation? So one thing it says is, some people might think the current law doesn't do enough to let the public know about hate crime and its seriousness. So one of the things they seem to be thinking is, this new legislation could have a kind of symbolic role of kind of transmitting to everybody in society how serious hate is, or hatred. It says, this is because, it has a few bullet points, currently, hate motivation is not part of the offense a person is charged with. Right? It's not part of the offense someone is charged with. You can take into account later at sentencing.
That's right.
But at the moment, you're not saying you're in trouble for a hate crime. You're saying you're in trouble for beating somebody up. And then maybe there's a hate element that we can add on later. And number two, sentencing decisions don't have to say whether a hate motivation was considered or how much it changed the sentence, right? So currently they can say at some point, oh, we're actually upping your sentence because there was this hate element. Now I think they would have to say, because it would, they have to justify
because
it
it's
being
built
a hate
into the
crime,
charge. Yeah.
that this is the evidence that hate was involved.
Yeah.
Three, the courts don't have to impose harsher sentences for hate crimes. Again, that implies that in the future, if this goes through, courts will have an obligation to up the sentence if it's a hate crime.
Well, there'll be a different sentencing schedule for a hate crime.
And finally, the maximum penalty for an offense is currently the same whether or not it is a hate crime.
Right.
So that might change too. So the maximum bar will
The maximum and average would both be lifted.
Yeah.
Because there is a concept that sort of runs through that, which I don't think that the Law Commission is necessarily promulgating, but there is an idea that exists in the conversation at the moment that hate crimes are more serious crimes than the crime itself.
That's right.
So a crime is made more serious by the fact that it's committed sort
Motivated
of with
by hate.
Exactly, with a
But that, I mean, that's already in place with the aggravated factor at sentencing.
Yeah.
You might well argue,
Yeah.
but they want to have these sort of signaling purposes to say, no,
Yeah.
this hate crime is like really serious, and we're going to signal that by calling it a hate crime rather than just a crime with some added hate on the top. That difference is still quite subtle, though, don't you think? Like,
Yeah.
they're already sentencing you to a heavier sentence for the hate element. They're just
Yeah.
saying now, like, no, that crime was kind of intrinsically related to hate. At the very beginning of this document, they say, hate crime focuses on the identity of the victim. Some people say this focus on identity causes additional mental harm, both to the victim and to other members of the affected community, who may also feel threatened or targeted. Some argue hate crime also causes harm to wider society by making people feel less connected to each other. So it seems like one of the things they're thinking here is, hatred is especially bad because it does harm not only to the individual who's being abused, but to the whole community that they're part of. And secondly, there's this even broader, more ambitious argument that it somehow does damage to the fabric of society.
Social cohesion, right?
Yeah. So
Well, I would have thought that crime in general does damage to social cohesion. That's why it's crime, and why we put people in court and find them and put them in prison if they commit crime.
You see what they mean, though, right? Like, if I punch you in the face, that's assault, fine. I go to jail, whatever. I go to fine. If I punch you in the face and say you're a bloody Australian, or let's not joke around. If I said something very anti-Semitic to you and you were Jewish,
yeah,
and maybe that went into the news and stuff, and other Jewish people in New Zealand saw that, you can understand that they might. It says here, they might feel more threatened. They might feel like, oh no, being a Jew is under attack in New Zealand. I feel less secure.
Yeah,
and then also, maybe the Jewish people in New Zealand would be a bit sort of shyer, or maybe some of them sort of fringe of them would get more aggressive towards other groups like Canadians or Muslims or whatever. And that's the argument. The other argument they put in there was that the whole idea of the fabric of society is starting to fray, right?
Yeah.
I think, there is a space for empathy for that, for sure. I think that, people in communities where they see things, when they see violence to people from their communities, that's going to have an effect on their sort of sense of safety and security within their community. Yeah. Of course, you can understand that and sympathize with that completely. I have real concerns, though, about the impact of social cohesion here. I think it stands to do much greater damage to social cohesion than supporting it, because what it really does, as far as I can see, is it sort of takes what is already a sort of human proclivity towards punishment, and this has been borne out psychologically. I think we could kind of unpack that if you wanted to. The Stanford prison experiment is a good example. There's a proclivity that people have, I think, to sort of punish people with ideas that are different to their own. And
we belong to different groups. The Stanford prison experiment, for listeners who don't know, is when they set up the basement of the psychology department at Stanford University as a mock prison. This was back in the 1960s. They randomly allocated participants to be prisoners or guards and put in place a kind of prison-like regime. And the whole thing deteriorated out of control within 3 days, and the guards behaved very abusively and so on, and it had to be called off. It's actually more to do with institutional obedience and group affiliation, like whether you're a prisoner or a guard, I think, than people who have different ideas. So but the group affiliation thing is relevant.
Yeah. And that's actually, it's mentioned by, that group affiliation idea is mentioned by the Law Commission as well. The idea that it might encourage people to sort of, it might create a situation where you've got certain groups sort of having a sort of...
Well, it risks a perception that certain groups are treated differently than certain other groups, right? So if there are certain protected categories and you belong to one of those protected categories, there's a risk that others might think you're getting some sort of special treatment, or you're being treated differently than somebody else would be if they were a victim of that crime. Yeah. So, and that could breed resentment.
Yes, exactly. And that resentment, I think, is something that I feel really concerned about. I feel really concerned about how people would use this to sort of use the law to try to seek punishment against people who hold different points of view to their own.
So this is really good. This is something I wanted to get onto, because it's my understanding too that at some point in this they raised the idea, at least, that if I've committed a crime and they've decided it's a hate crime, they can also, as part of their determination of how severe it is or whether I'm guilty, they can not only look at what I've said in the moment. So imagine I beat you up and I say, you're a terrible Kiwi or you're a terrible Jew or whatever. They take that into account. I use a racial epithet. And they can also go back into my history. So maybe if I'm a lecturer, they can pick up on something I've said in a lecture, or if I've written articles, or maybe, I don't know what the scope of this is, but Could they look at my emails and maybe if I've been commenting online?
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
so you can imagine
group affiliation. Yeah.
So in some ways, like I understand why they're doing this, because you can imagine, for example, a situation where somebody really was like a neo-Nazi, and there's one episode where they call somebody a bloody kike and they beat them up, and then they find all this other stuff. And in that situation, this person is like a dedicated anti-Semite and neo-Nazi, and they've been waging this sort of campaign against Jews for years. That kind of makes sense to me that they might want to punish that person more aggressively. However, you change the example slightly. Imagine, you know, somebody gets in a fight with their wife, there's a domestic abuse incident, they just got drunk one night, they're not usually like that. And then you go searching back onto their online history and you find that they've written things about sex differences or, you know, said stuff about women not being as good at sport or mathematics or whatever it is. You might not agree with those views, but they're kind of legitimate views to have. But in the current environment where everything is sort of very slanted to one side politically, there's a lot of sensitivity about feminism and things like that. There's a huge risk, I think, that would become
a marker of misogyny.
Say, you know, a serious threat to free speech.
So just to fill that in a bit, I share that concern completely. And it's worth noting that in the Law Commission report, they talk about this in relation to the existing provision for aggravated sentencing. So if somebody is thought to have committed a crime with a hate motivation, the judge giving them a longer sentence. They've said this has happened in a couple of, they give some examples of when it's happened. One was a history of hostility against Muslims. Now, how is that going to be determined? Is it saying, well, I really don't like Muhammad and I think he was a vicious warlord? Is that a history of hostility against Muslims? Certainly Muslims might think so.
It sounds like hostility to me.
Right.
I mean, I don't want you to be punished for it, but that sounds like hostility.
Right. And the other one was, you know, to pick up on your example, membership of a white supremacist group. But again, who defines what a white supremacist group is? The word racist is thrown around with gay abandon in our culture at the moment, and you can just imagine maybe if you're a member of Hobson's Pledge or something. And, is that a white supremacist group? Certainly, I would say that some members of the Māori Party might say so, and others who have sympathy to them. So I think the definition of hatred is dangerous, just like it is with hate speech. You know, you get into some very woolly territory. But the point that I want to make is that problem is already in place with the sentencing provisions. Yes. It exists already and it's been used in the past.
There are problems already with the system that we have, for sure. But I think this all kind of reveals one of the key issues here, which is how on earth do you go about actually determining a hate motivation? And this is why in the law, traditionally, motivation is not something that's factored in, because it really depends on.
It can be. I mean, for example, it's the difference between murder and manslaughter.
Yes, but yes, but it's not something that's actually written into the law itself. So again, we're talking about the difference between something being like at sentencing versus in the law itself.
Well, again, the difference between murder and manslaughter are separate charges.
Yes.
So that
with a high burden of proof, right? Which is
the same burden of proof in each case. It has to be beyond reasonable doubt. Yeah. But in the case of murder, you have to prove also that the person did it on purpose.
Yeah.
So, but again, look, the fact is we already have this problem with the sentencing provisions, and it's still not clear to me why what they're proposing is worse from a free speech perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting with the murder example. I mean, the intention there is, so what kind of factor do they take into account? So the difference between murder and manslaughter, as I understand it, is basically with murder, you really intended to do it.
That's right.
Manslaughter, you didn't. You just killed someone.
You killed someone because you were an idiot.
Exactly. But here it's something a bit more than that, isn't it? It's because here it's more like, why are you committing the murder? So this is actually quite a philosophical question that maybe we can go into for a short time, which is just, so I guess this whole idea of hate crime or having hate or hatred as an aggravating factor is an idea that's supposed to be intuitive, that if there's sort of hatred added in or added on top, that makes something worse. And I actually think that's an assumption we can question. I mean, it might be right. There are a lot of examples where it seems natural. You know, if you're a parent and your child gets beaten up and killed, is it worse if your child has also been insulted? I think that's kind of a nice question in the sense it's sort of hard to decide, right? Because you might argue what really hurts is the fact that your child has been beaten up and killed.
Well, that seems pretty pretty clear. I mean, I suppose to steelman the other argument, if you are a member of a minority and your child was killed by somebody who was kind of vociferously hating your minority, then there would be an added sting. I mean, for sure, losing a child in any circumstances is awful. To lose a child to murder would be an order of magnitude worse. But perhaps it is made substantially worse if the person who did it hates you because of who you are.
So let's change the example slightly, because I want to get at the idea of hate making things worse. Because we might say hatred for an ethnicity makes things worse because there's this added level of insult. The hatred seems to be quite broad, right? So another example might be, I murder you, Michael, because once you beat me at chess, and I've hated you ever since. I've hated you for some petty reason.
Yeah.
Right. Does that make it worse than I've murdered you because of that, rather than for some other reason?
I wouldn't say so in general. I mean, when you commit murder, almost by definition, you have some motive, unless you're a complete psychopath.
That's right.
So why does it matter what that motive is?
So if I murder you for hatred, is that worse than if I murder you for jealousy, or because I'm arrogant, like I'm a narcissist or something, and I just think your life doesn't matter? Is hatred, does that make it worse? And if it's not hatred that makes it worse, if it's really just this sort of tight band of racial hatred.
I mean, I suppose there could be an argument from the likelihood that you'll do it again, which is to say that if you commit a crime of passion, say you catch somebody in flagrante delicto with your spouse and murder them, then that's a kind of one-off thing and unlikely to recur. Still a terrible crime, and you should still go to prison. But if you murder somebody,
Athens, by the way, but yeah, keep going. In case you can get her tickets to classical Athens. Then.
Oh, there you go. If you murder somebody because of a group they belong to, and you hate that group, then why wouldn't you just keep killing people who belong to that group?
That's kind of the intuition behind this whole idea that, if you find out somebody is a kind of career anti-Semite, it does seem kind of natural to me to think, oh, we should punish that person more severely.
Yeah, I think the distinction in some of these examples is between something that's sort of an innate quality that a person just possesses, versus something about their behavior in life. Those are two different things, and I can see a distinction there.
Yeah, but however it may be, I have a real problem with whether it's judges deciding at sentencing that someone deserves a longer sentence or a separate category of crimes called hate crimes. I have a real problem that they can delve into one's history of speech to establish hate.
Yes.
It seems to me that if you want to have a provision like this, and again, I'm kind of agnostic, I don't think it's great either way, but if you want to have some hate provision, whether it's at sentencing or a separate category of crime, the hate should be pretty much part and parcel of the crime itself. That is, it should be clear that at that time the crime was motivated by hate, not just that you have some history of hating people like this.
So can I just try and briefly defend like an extreme free speech line, because we're on Free Kiwis?
Yeah.
So how about this? Like, maybe it doesn't matter at all what the intention is or what people are thinking and what kind of emotion is in their head while they're committing a crime. Like, you might defend the position, for example, that murder is bad, we should punish murder. Beating people up is bad, we should punish that. We should punish theft. But actually, the fact that the thief stole my computer because he happens to hate me is neither here nor there. And if we start going down that road, then it's a slippery slope, as you say, to, because and you have to define things like in the moment. Like, what does in the moment mean? Like, if I declare before I go into your house, I've always hated Michael because of his haircut, and then I go into the house and murder you, is that at the time? And if so, like, do I get an hour? Do I get 2 hours?
Well, it might just be that it's very hard to prove. But look, the judges at the moment take all sorts of things into consideration when they sentence, and a lot of those things are the kind of motive the person had, and whether it was a particularly heinous thing that they did. Perhaps if the person was much less powerful than them, say it's a child, I think that would aggravate sentencing. So there are a great many things that are taken into account, and probably should be, because yes, murder is always a terrible crime, but some murders perhaps are worse than others and deserve harsher sentencing.
Okay, so our concern is specifically with things that are taken into account that we might otherwise want to defend in terms of expressive rights. And to be fair to the Law Commission, they do often note that there is a compelling interest in terms of expressive rights.
Yeah.
Okay, so one other worry I have about this is just because I don't think we look at any of these things in isolation. We're always thinking about what's going on in other countries. And in the UK, of course, there was a long period, I think it's still ongoing actually, where people were issued with these so-called non-crime hate
Yes,
incidents.
that is still
Yeah.
ongoing.
Police would come to your door, or they would get in touch with you, and they would say, you know, it's come to our attention that you posted this on Twitter, you said this in public, or you wrote something into the newspaper, and it's not a crime. We're not charging you with anything. However, we're going to record the fact that this happened, which you might surely like breaches all sorts of.
You would think so, especially
Right.
since
Think.
it can have consequences, because the fact that it's been recorded
Right.
can be supplied to a potential employer who does a police check on you, for example.
Yeah.
So
I think there's been a long battle to do with this, waged partly by the Free Speech Union in the UK. And I think at some point they actually got some kind of injunction telling them to stop doing this.
but they didn't stop doing it.
But they're still doing it.
I believe that my understanding is that they're still doing it. And actually we did, and this is something that the Free Speech Union did quite a bit of work with the police on last year, was that another thing that came out of this with the Royal Commission and the recommendations went straight to police was to start checking similar sorts of incidents.
Well, they were training,
and that was
people.
happening last year.
Was it happening?
Training.
Or it was in the training, where I don't think there was any recorded instance of it having happened, like a police officer actually fronting up and saying you've committed a non-crime hate incident. Or
Well, because we've dealt with some of these issues in terms of people sort of posting things online that were determined to be hateful, and then police knocking on their door, and it was
that did actually happen in New
It
Zealand.
did actually happen in New
Oh,
Zealand.
so you think like a handful of cases, or like 20 or 74?
I mean, hard to know.
Yeah.
We've spoken with a few people,
Okay.
like
Interesting.
handful sort of thing, but
Well, that's very good stuff.
I suspect there's probably more than that.
Yeah, so the reason I raise this is because there's part of this document where it says, we are interested in whether hate motivation is being consistently investigated by police and raised by prosecutors at sentencing. The recent changes to police guidance and training could help improve its response to hate crime, but it may be too early to know. So it doesn't, say they're going to do this, but I'm just kind of worried about that. And it seems to say it says at several points, we don't know enough about how much hate crime is going on. And it just seems like they really want to extend the scope of police investigations.
Yeah, but you don't.
I'm a little bit worried.
You don't usually create a category of crime in order to find out how often it's committed. You create the category of crime to stop people doing whatever it is.
Yeah. You know that murder is a problem, or you know that it's a possibility, and you want to stop it.
So we have actually, this is something that, sorry, I'm just trying to find it. It's something that they talk about in the Law Commission report as well, is that the police have been trying to sort of gather data in New Zealand for the last few years. They've been doing it since 2021. Reported evidence flagged as perceived hate crimes. So one of the pieces of data evidence that's talked about in this report is these incidences that they have had come through the police that have been flagged as perceived hate crimes. A serious concern that I have, that you've probably many of you probably will have picked up in hearing, is perceived hate crime.
Well, of course.
So these are things that people have reported to the police that they say, I think that was based on hate.
So there's no standard of evidence there. It's just they report it as being that way.
All of a sudden, justice is in the hands of the perception, and that's a scary line to go down.
That's right. And the other thing that the Law Commission do note here is that the increase since 2021 actually might not be because there has been an increase in so-called hate incidents, but actually just because it's been a bit of a hot topic, and so people are more likely to say, yes, I think hate was involved.
Yes.
When you turn the social temperature up, these things happen.
Exactly.
Okay, so one of the main things we've been trying to figure out here is, how is the new legislation, or the possible new legislation, different? And they do have a handy table in the document that I read where it says, as at present, with the sentence aggravation model, where the hate element aggravates the sentence, all offenses are covered. The new legislation, only specific offenses will be treated as hate crimes. In the existing legislation, any enduring common characteristic is what's important. In the new legislation, it will be only a specified list of characteristics. It actually seems to narrow the band of things that you can get in trouble for in terms of hate crime. Is hate motivation recorded as part of the conviction? At present, the answer is no.
Or it might be.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
And what they want to make sure with the new legislation is that if there's any hatred involved, this will be spoken out. This will in public, it will be a matter of public record.
That's
that
right.
This is
Of course, you could fix that by simply saying if a judge imposes a sentence premium for an aggravating factor of hatred, they have to record that they did that. You don't need to. It
seems a bit funny to me because I believe in transparency and I think people should know what's going on. But if the concern of the Law Commission are these sort of social effects of ethnic minorities being intimidated that hate crimes have occurred, then the thing to do would surely be not to announce it to the public, right? You should bring in a law saying under no circumstances should anybody say that a Jew has been beaten up and called a filthy Jew, right? But anyway, it's a philosophical point.
Well, there was for a long-standing philosophy of that on the reporting of suicide. There was a kind of code which was that the police are not seeking anyone in connection with this or something like that.
We treated hate crime like that, and this is kind of
well, there were no suspicious circumstances.
Seems to be a tendency here to treat hatred as that kind of contagion effect, social contagion effect. And if that's the case, then it would seem to tend against transparency. But I do like transparency. That's just I just wonder whether they contradict themselves there. Is there a higher maximum penalty for a hate crime? Currently, no. Under the new legislation, yes. And then it compares some other jurisdictions where there are currently hate crimes of the sort that they're hoping to introduce here on the books. Western Australia, Queensland, and England and Wales, which also has sentence aggravation alongside hate crimes.
So as you just noted, in fact, the proposed new hate crime provision in some ways would narrow the scope of the circumstances in which somebody would end up with a harsher sentence because of a hate motivation. The only thing that doesn't is the increase in maximum sentence that might come along with a new category of crime.
Yeah, and there's another point here. I mean, it says currently hate motivation doesn't need to be proven at trial and is often not disputed. So with the sentence aggravation model, it seems like you get convicted or you're on the way to being convicted of beating up someone. And then later on someone says, oh, by the way, he also called me a bad word, referred to me with a racial slur during this attack. And then there's actually seems to be like a very low standard of evidence there. And so this change actually might make it more difficult to convict someone of hate crime because you actually have to.
Well, that's my point. That's exactly my point.
It seems to me that these hate crimes, though, are looking to be incredibly subjective, and I have serious concerns that their bar for proving the hate element is going to be.
I completely agree with you, but how is that different now with the sentencing provision? It's similarly nebulous and open to interpretation.
Well, my understanding, I mean, you mentioned before that the judge needs to be, and I'm not saying that there aren't problems with the way that things are at the moment, because I think that there are, and we'll be sort of making some recommendations for some amendments that could be made to what's already there in the Sentencing Act to tighten it, and because of some of the things that you've already raised. But at the moment, there is my understanding is that there's quite a high burden of proof on being able to demonstrate.
There is. It needs to be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt. Yeah. And the same would hold with a new category of crime, because any criminal matter that comes before a court has to be proven beyond reasonable doubt.
Okay, so here's something that may help your position out, Steph. So here it says, specific hate crime offenses may have some advantages compared to the sentence aggravation model, so what they're looking to move to. And one of the points it says is, it may mean that more offenses are investigated and prosecuted as hate crimes. And I wonder what they're referring to there. And I wonder whether it goes back to those examples that you thought of at the beginning. Like there may be things which are just hate crimes of their own, and they're not necessarily crime plus hatred.
Yeah.
That hate crime, having a category of hate crime would allow you to capture those.
Well, that's my concern.
Right.
And what are the hate crimes that we're talking about? I mean, it seems to me that there is a serious risk here that, I mean, hate is so subjective.
That's right.
Inherently, it's so subjective, right? And so, like, one of the principles of the rule of law that we know is important is that the law has to be predictable. And I can't see how, in this kind of a setup, people are going to be able to predict the law, because how do you know if a behavior that you're showing towards someone else, they're going to interpret as being hateful?
So here I agree with you completely. My argument is restricted to the circumstance in which the new hate crimes mirror already existing crimes.
Yeah, and I'm not
But
quite clear
but
about the extent to which they do. If there are
but
extra,
if it goes beyond
yeah,
that,
that opens
and
a
if
whole
something
box, doesn't it?
becomes a crime
Yeah.
only because of some element of hatred,
Well, that's why
I
I
think
raised
that
the
is
thing at the
hugely
beginning about the Royal
problematic.
Commission saying that offensive language and behavior. Well, the Royal Commission were recommending that be looked into. It doesn't necessarily say here that they're going to actually put that in the hate crimes legislation, but it is a worry if they're looking at things which are not actually already crimes, but they just become crimes again on this subjective basis that hatred is involved. Then I think you do have a lot of problems with, well, who gets to define hatred in this situation?
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think also this is the sort of situation where when you open the door,
Yeah,
things inevitably expand outwards, right?
Yeah.
So perhaps at the beginning we're not looking at a situation, initially it might only be things that are already crimes, but if we open the door to hate crimes existing,
yeah.
then it's very easy for that to spiral out and for new things to be added in as hate crimes.
Perhaps.
over
Although you could
time.
build into legislation that a hate crime could only be
You could.
a mirror
You could.
of an existing law. By the way, I'm not supporting the idea at all. I don't like either the idea of a hate crime or the existing sentencing provisions, although I could probably accept a more restricted version of the sentencing provisions, which I've already kind of mentioned, which is where where hate can only be established by things that are said or done extraneous to the crime at around the time when it's committed.
Yeah, and you have quite a tight definition of around.
And yes, that could be very hard
saying it
to
while you're punching the
Yes.
person. It
and
can't
that could be very hard to
Yes.
infer, but so be it. It just means that you can't necessarily prove it in every case. A lot of crimes are like that.
Yeah, the law's always often
Yeah.
a little bit messy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess going back to what Steph was saying, I do have a worry about this idea that behaviors. So I have a really big worry about the idea that just speech, language, offensive language could become a hate crime, which the recommendations of the Royal Commission it seems the fact they've included that here seems to suggest that they're sort of thinking about that. But even the idea that offensive behaviors might become hate crime, I think is very dangerous because behaviors sounds like actions, and it indeed is actions, but there are behaviors which are part of the sort of expressive palette of people. So there are things that you could do as an expression of a political view, for example. So a perfect example is like, what if you deface the rainbow crossings because you don't like LGBT people, or you just think it's gone too far, or you don't like the color scheme, or whatever it is. I mean, we may not like any of those particular views, but it's a pluralistic society.
So what
shouldn't be prosecuted for the views they hold.
What if you draw?
That clearly limits their expressive rights.
What if you draw horns and a Groucho Marx moustache on a poster of David Seymour? Does that mean that you've committed a hate crime against ACT supporters?
It's offensive, right? It's a behavior and it's offensive.
Yeah.
So if they are looking at that kind of thing for hate crime, then that would seem to be captured. I think then we'll have to go back into the language of what specific characteristics are protected, because it may mean that you have to be insulting the sort of class of David Seymour's.
Well, it's actually no. I mean, I think
libertarians.
that that's the thing. So political views may well be part of the protected characteristics.
Right. So then it would just be you're not allowed to insult libertarians or communists, which is absurd because a lot of political discourse consists of people mocking their rivals' views.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It becomes a very dangerous.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and the same is true of religion, right? If I depict Muhammad, then some Muslims would say that I'm guilty. In fact, I think most Muslims would say that that's a grievous sin against the Prophet, and therefore I'm expressing hostility against their religion, and I'm guilty, therefore, of hatred, which could then be used to.
And that's actually on the books in certain European countries, as I believe, right? So in Sweden, there was that recent case where the guy burned a Quran, and he was arrested for it, maybe put in jail.
Yeah, that's right.
And again, like I'm not saying I like to go out and burn Qurans every day, but I don't even necessarily think if there was some kind of performance art where someone burned a Quran that I would like go along. But again, we're a free society. You're allowed to have contempt for great books of various cultures. You're allowed to think they're not very good, they're not very interesting. You're allowed to buy
a copy and burn one if you really want to.
Exactly, and that's very important for our ability to actually deal with ideas honestly and openly.
And that to me is the kind of underlying issue with all of these things, whether it's hate speech laws or this hate crime law or the sentencing provisions, whatever it is this cultural shift towards the idea that offence ought to be criminalised, that causing offence ought to be criminalised. Because 40 years ago, that wasn't really a thing in Western cultures, right?
Yeah, because basically I think
Yeah.
that the intellectual elite, which was sort of relatively weak at the time, the kind of bohemian intellectual elite, basically felt contempt towards Christianity. But because they kind of controlled the cultural sphere, that was okay. Whereas now the new establishment, the cultural elite kind of controls the new establishment. And so you're not allowed to criticize that, right? But we know from surveys that a lot of people at the moment find that it's very difficult to criticize certain ideas or even to discuss certain ideas. And one of the reasons for that is this kind of pall of respectability, right? There's certain things it's not really nice to say, but that actually does limit the space in which you can discuss ideas. And it's very important, as we've seen in the past, to be able to discuss even ideas, or perhaps especially ideas that have this kind of carapace of respectability, right? So the ideas of the Catholic Church, for example, or the ideas of dictatorial regimes, they probably seem quite respectable in those regimes themselves, right?
Right.
But it's very important to make sure that citizens can actually do things that to a lot of their peers may look incredibly disrespectful and rude and stupid and, not well advised. That's a really important right to.
Indeed, and they should be
Hold on.
subject to criticism for those things, but not for to criminal sanction.
Well, exactly. And that's what happens, right? When people sort of act in outlandish ways, generally speaking, people respond to that.
It's policed socially rather than with the
Exactly,
law.
exactly.
That's right.
And that's the better way to do it, right?
Perfect. Okay.
So on that note, we probably should move on.
We've talked for a long time about that. Do you still have time?
Well, there's just one other thing I just wanted to come back to, because we've used the phrase a few times around protected characteristics, and I think that's one of the sort of critical flaws in the idea as well that I think is really worth drawing out, because again, I talked before about the rule of law meaning that law needs to be predictable. People need to be able to know that they're breaking a law before they are punished for it. Likewise, that kind of suggests that there are certain characteristics that are better protected by the law than others. So certain groups of people are sort of safer under the law than others, and it suggests that there's sort of a disparity between access to justice for different groups. And I think that's a real
That's
problem
interesting,
too.
isn't it? And it's also sort of dividing society in a certain way. Like, I think the state should be as neutral as possible. And it's kind of like choosing particular ways in which we should look at people. That always bothers me about this kind of thing. Because you might take the view, for example, that race doesn't really matter that much, right? But if you start thinking about, no, these people, we should categorize people by race, that might have flow-on effects. Precisely, actually, on sort of social cohesion and stuff, which is
exactly.
that they're worried
and
about.
That's one of the ways in which I could really see it having deleterious effects for social cohesion. Because it's saying, you've got protected characteristics, so you're more entitled to the law than these other people who don't possess these protected characteristics. I think that's a very dangerous road.
Agreed.
Okay. Thank you very much for raising that. Okay, do you have a bit more time? We're going to talk about
the academic
Victoria University of Wellington new academic freedom policy.
Yes.
And I have an article here, which I think was in the Post, 24th October last year, by Dr. Michael Johnson and Dr. James Kirsted. I have Dr. Michael Johnson here. I actually have Dr.
And here's Dr. Kirsted also.
See him, but he's here.
The two authors are both in the room.
And they had various complaints about the Victoria University of Wellington academic freedom policy that was put out then, or the draft policy that was put out then. This one that we've just got, I think, is the final version. But okay, so what do we complain about in this article? Do you remember off the top of your head? I can help you, but
well, one of the big things was the lack of institutional neutrality or protection for or assertion of institutional neutrality in the original draft.
It does say Victoria pledges to remain neutral in public matters. We actually commend them for that, but maybe they don't go as far. Like, I get the impression this new version is much clearer on that point.
I do recall us talking last time we did one of these podcasts. We had talked about the fact that they'd said that, but then there were various kind of clauses that undermined the fact that they'd promised that institutional neutrality. It does seem. Oh, sorry, giving the game away.
No, that's
exactly.
No,
I think it is clear now. The only thing that they're reserving the right to take an institutional view of, which I think is fair enough, is matters pertaining to higher education.
Yes.
They're a higher education institution, and so they need to be able to speak with a particular position on public policy matters.
That makes sense, right?
Yeah. Their mission and purpose, as it were, right?
Yeah. So if the new policy comes out saying we're going to cut all the humanities subjects to universities are allowed to not be neutral on that.
Correct. That's right.
But if it's something to do with like Israel, Palestine, or something in the election of an American president, it's not the role of a New Zealand university to come out and say
they have a view
for Trump or we're against Trump or whatever.
That's right.
Because it's kind of not their job. They like also in a lot of these cases, I think is very little internal democracy, right? So often, like when I was at Vic, the vice chancellor would come out and say something on behalf of the university, or like I felt like there were statements being pushed out, official positions being taken up by the university.
Oh, there's
And
no
I
doubt.
just think, not in my name. I just think
I mean,
about, how did you get
a
to
very
this?
good example is when I was associate dean in the education faculty, the university gave students dispensation to attend the student strike for climate in Auckland on a particular day, and said, oh, if you've got an assessment on this day, it'll have to be moved. Your lecturers will have to move it. You're not expected to turn up to lectures or tutorials on this day. You can get extensions on assignments and
Yeah.
so on. And there were a couple of us. There was the associate dean from law and me in particular, saying, "Well, it's hardly a protest, is it? If the university has basically invited its students to take an excursion to it,
Well,
and also it's very clearly the university taking a supportive position about that protest."
Imagine if you took an alternative view. Let's say that catastrophizing about climate change, you might take the view, say that climate change is a real thing, but if you encourage children to catastrophize about it, it actually worsens their mental health, which we can see is getting worse for several years. And one possible reason is that there's all this catastrophizing about climate change, and therefore that schools, shouldn't be doing this. If you took that view, for example, then you might feel that the university was kind of speaking on your behalf in a way that was kind of coercive.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is part of why universities, it's not appropriate for universities to take positions like that. Right?
So let's say they've done pretty well on that.
Yeah, I think they've done. Apparently they did okay the first time, but this time they've made it extra clear, and we really like that. So it sounded very negative when we were talking about it, because it's something that made us both angry, I think, when we were at Vic, but they've actually done good on that front. Okay. I'm just looking through the list of things we complained about in the past. So one thing we complained about was that it said things should be read in conjunction with the campus life policy and bear in mind health and safety issues, et cetera, et cetera. I think there is still quite a lot of health and safety stuff in the new version.
Yeah.
And it's always a little bit vague, because again, if they could be counted on to mean by health and safety, kind of, there shouldn't be any kind of ladders left around, or nails
or something perhaps more opposite, that if a given invited speaker was likely to engender a riot, then that would have to be weighed up. And I think as strong an advocate as I am for free expression, a talk isn't worth somebody's life, and if it was that bad, then maybe they should say, actually, they should make every effort to provide security. But if it's that bad, then sometimes you might just have to say, not today.
Do you think in New Zealand there's a genuine risk of that happening?
I think it's extremely low.
Because I think that's more
at
often,
the moment.
I mean, used as an excuse to shut things down, right?
Yeah, well, that's the problem. And of course, the much more insidious one is your speech is harmful. It affects my health and safety, and so you shouldn't say it.
You should know you're especially harmful with your speech, Mr. Johnson.
Exactly. And, I and your colleague, Jonathan Ayling, were both accused of causing harm with our speech over that free speech event at Victoria last year. So we can easily see that kind of provision can be invoked in very dishonest ways.
Still doing it. Some people never learn. Okay, another thing that we didn't like was that they had a clause in the previous version, about misinformation and disinformation, which we said at the time is kind of dumb, because basically any idea that you disagree with, you're liable to label as intentional falsehood or unintentional falsehood, which is basically misinformation, disinformation. And you can't rule ideas out on the basis that you think they're false, either intentionally or not. Otherwise, you can't have any kind of debate.
I have a particular problem with this one, because it strikes at the heart of what the university is for, which is to contest ideas, as it were, without end. So the idea is the matter is never settled. It's always up for more debate. If somebody comes with fresh evidence or a fresh view, then we should hear it and dispute it if necessary, and agree with it if it's warranted. And that process should always go on. So a university should never be in a position of judging whether something is misinformation or not, and therefore not to be spoken about. We can say there's a massive weight of evidence in favor of this idea, but that doesn't mean that speaking against it is misinformation.
Right. Okay. So again,
and actually, misinformation, disinformation, I think we might have talked about this last time. Even the concept that such a thing exists undermines the institutional neutrality in the way that I was just sort of alluding to.
All right, because they have.
You're right. You're quite right.
That's because there's not how else.
Yeah.
How else? Where I really like some of the phrasing that's in the new sort of version now. If I can just read this out, I just particularly liked the way that this is put, the exercise of the right to freedom of expression may include exposure to controversial ideas, hosting speakers who contest orthodoxies, engaging in debate about controversial issues, and engaging in lawful protests. And they have kind of got a description there around lawful protests and what that looks like.
That's a really strong clause.
But yeah, I think so. Just hosting speakers who contest orthodoxies, they've actually gone so far as to specify having people who contradict the sort of main view.
So I think
is a benefit. So I think
pick for her.
It's a little gold star.
We're actually giving them a gold star, and I agree with you.
Well, because we're being negative about the previous one.
Really heartened me and made me think maybe they have turned a corner this time.
Yeah.
So a couple other things we complained about, or maybe I'll just do one more of these. So the Treaty of Waitangi statute, which is a policy that Victoria University of Wellington has to kind of interpret the Treaty of Waitangi and say what its values are.
For the technically, a statute is a bit stronger than a policy. It's
a souped-up policy.
Yep.
But is this in the new one? Is there also mention of the Treaty of Waitangi in the new one?
Yes, there is. So there's still room to kind of abrogate academic freedom or freedom of expression if it contravenes the university's values, which are listed for Māori words, and or the Treaty of Waitangi statute. So
I think there's more than 4. I think we had in our article Kai Tiakitanga, Manakitanga, and Akaranga. There's several more.
Yeah, okay. So so whatever the values are, and values, of course, particularly nebulous things. I've always made the argument that institutions shouldn't really state values, because what does it mean for an institution to have values? In the end, individual people do, and they vary across an institution. And I guess you could say if the institution has values at all, it's some aggregate of the
they're
values.
Embodied in a set of rules or regulations.
Yeah.
Well, they could be, but to me, those are rules and regulations, not values.
Yeah, I think just on the kind of statute policy point, my understanding is that statutes kind of hold more ground than policies do. And so I do think that there's a particular risk with this, because the reference in the policy is to the principles of the Te Tiriti o Waitangi statute. So that obviously holds, it's got stronger positioning. And one of the concerns that we've talked about around academic freedom is the fact that it doesn't seem to be held as the priority, right? Like other things sort of come in and contravene it and override it. And I think there's a lot of scope there for this policy to be undermined by statutes that advance other concepts.
Yeah, so there's another passage where it says health and safety and other considerations must limit academic freedom. And I always think, why do I always read that? I never see concerns of free speech must limit the scope.
Yeah, it's never the other way around, right?
So
yeah, because there's a question of prioritization here, which has always been one of our concerns, right?
Yeah.
I think we've all shared that concern.
Well, unless you're going to have some sort of specious idea that speech itself is harmful or jeopardizes health and safety, it's hard to see the relevance.
Exactly. I mean, that's a tell, in my view, that they do think of health and safety in this very kind of unnatural, weird way. Like when I think of health and safety, I think you shouldn't have a ladder with a bucket of paint on it because it'll fall on my head, because that's Sod's law, right? Always going to happen to me. You should be thinking about things like that. And even more seriously, things can fall over and hurt people, or they can trip over, right? That's health and safety. Health and safety isn't cultural safety, whatever that means, or like a word may wound your feelings. That in the old days would have just been called conversations or exchanging ideas.
Yeah.
Like what they were just talking about.
Was that
challenging orthodoxy, having the conversations, right?
They themselves say that they want to do.
Yeah. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out, right?
Yeah.
Like when this actually comes into force,
and whenever you have
prioritized.
Whenever you have some restrictions on academic freedom or freedom of expression, who is it that makes the call? And for example, if there are minority group organizations within the university who don't like somebody and thinks that they've said things against them in the past, then they could easily make a claim that this person is jeopardizing their safety by being on campus. We had that with the free speech event last year. The student union leaders were claiming that people might walk through the hub and hear the event inadvertently and thereby be harmed. And so that's why they had to take it and put it in a lecture theatre where that wouldn't happen. So it starts to, again, undermine potentially the mission of the university, or one of the missions of the university, which is to educate young people, which means getting them used to hearing ideas they don't like and disagree with.
It's kind of like a collateral damage model of free speech, where a speech event, like an event where people are speaking on a panel, is kind of like gangsters like spraying bullets around a neighborhood, and then if you happen to pass by the street,
You
like a
cop
stray
one.
bullet might
That's right.
a stray idea might suddenly hit you
Yeah.
in the jugular.
I was
Yeah.
just thinking that it's like a just in case, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe wear some kind of flak jacket or something, or work out your mind so that it can deal with ideas coming into it, because it actually has a natural capacity to deal with ideas.
Earmuffs.
Earmuffs. Yeah, steel earmuffs. I don't know what stops dangerous ideas, but actually the problem is kind of nothing except for better ideas, right? And earmuffs. Yeah, better ideas and earmuffs.
Yeah.
Heard it from the
But better
free
still hear the ideas,
Yeah.
work up some resilience, work up some counter arguments and say them.
Yeah, that also works. Okay, so just on the Treaty of Waitangi, I want to stress this because we've actually been involved, Michael and I have been involved in surveys of New Zealand University students. And you've been involved, or FSU has been involved in surveys of academics. And the number one thing in all these surveys, when they actually ask about, what's the thing you feel most worried about discussing, is, ta-da, the Treaty of Waitangi.
Yeah. Well,
right?
of course.
So then the university
how else could it be?
Right, so the university's coming out. Oh, you think it's an effect of the university constantly saying you can't talk about the Treaty of Waitangi?
Well, they're literally saying that
Yeah.
this is kind of sacred ground, and you can't.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, sex
of
and
course
gender
people-
was a close second, as I
It's a
recall.
close second. I think there's probably something in the air anyway. Like with the massive slant on university campuses, I think there's probably social reasons as well. Why most of your colleagues are not going to agree with you if you take a certain position on the Treaty of Waitangi. But then, whatever the reason is why academics are worried, and I agree, there's probably lots of official documentation about this as well, and that's another reason why they're worried. But whatever the reason is, the fact is, like, that's the thing that people are most worried about when it comes to academic freedom, right? And then Victoria University of Wellington is saying, we want to be a champion for academic freedom. It says that, right? We want to be a champion of
Yeah.
academic freedom. So how do you help the environment for academic freedom? Well, how about you start with the thing that most academics, in terms of a plurality, are telling you is the thing that worries them, right?
Yeah.
And the way of doing that would be to not have this thing saying you can say whatever you want except about the Treaty of Waitangi, because that's
Yeah.
a statute.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's a sacred cow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
It absolutely is.
And obviously, it's something that New Zealanders need to talk about. We've got this treaty principles bill before Parliament, which is very controversial. There are some people greatly in support of it. There are some people who are vociferously opposed to it. Clearly, we need to have a national conversation about it because the temperature has turned up on that issue. And as we all know, we free speech advocates, the best way to take the heat out of an issue is to talk about it and keep talking about it until you reach some kind of a position where people are more or less happy. That doesn't mean we ever solve the problem. It doesn't mean we all come to agree. But the alternative to that is for resentments to fester until they come back armed with weapons instead of words. So always we should welcome open debate about everything, and certainly on university campuses, that's what they're for.
Yeah. I actually think it's particularly important on this as well because the Waitangi Tribunal themselves have said that the principles of the treaty and the kind of alluding to sort of the same values as we see here listed as university values, things like manaakitanga and whanaungatanga, they say that these sort of principles are things that are contextually bound and that change over time, and interpretation is actually a really valid, is an important aspect of them. So if we're not able to have the conversations about these principles, but the principles are kind of determined by context and over time, how does that happen if we can't have these conversations? So it seems to me that actually in order to honor the treaty, it's necessary to be able to talk about the treaty.
Yeah. But
that's how it seems to me anyway.
Well, I mean,
I agree with
why
that,
should people have to honor the treaty?
Oh, that's a good point. Well, because if you don't, you're racist.
Well, apparently, but I mean, in a free society, I mean, it has some legal force in New Zealand. That's fair enough, but that doesn't mean we have to honor it. It just means we have to obey the law. We don't have to hold it in any esteem.
If it's part of the law, and people say it's involved in the law in various ways, but you might question the view, for example, that a treaty signed between a confederation of chiefs and the British Crown in 1840 is something that everybody has to reverence nowadays. Like you
don't have to
reverence necessarily right, but you might question that idea.
In a democracy, you don't have to reverence anything. You have to obey the law, but that's all.
I guess my point was just that if that's the motivation, then actually they would serve that motivation well by allowing open discourse about these things.
Of course, that's right.
I think.
Yeah. So I mean, the Maori values that the university has adopted, I also have a big problem with. I had a big problem with them when I was at Victoria University of Wellington as a lecturer because I'm a Canadian immigrant and I have tried to learn Maori, but I haven't really succeeded. And still to this day, I look at this list of words.
You've done a lot much better than me.
Whanangatanga, Akoranga, Whai Mataranga. I can see Mataranga means knowledge. Whanau is family, so Whanangatanga is something like family belonging or whatever. Akoranga has to do with students, maybe learning, something like that. But it's like you should, as an employee of the university, if they're saying these are our values, and also if they're saying your fundamental speech rights, which are actually guaranteed by various conventions like the UN Convention on Human Rights and the New Zealand Bill of Rights, yeah, they're all good. And also your academic freedom, which is guaranteed in the Education Act, all good, but they're limited by all these words that you don't know the meaning of. And also, when you click on the website and go to the description of these things, they are extremely vague and woolly and kind of hippie-ish.
Yeah.
Right? It's all about belonging. It's like, okay, but surely if I get in a big argument with Michael about the nature of consciousness, that risks, fracturing our sense of belonging, because sometimes arguments get, tough.
Although,
and
curiously, when we argue about ideas, it seems to tighten our friendship, strangely enough. There's something maybe to learn there, right?
It's almost like we had academic training that was actually good and encouraged us to think of that as like part of exploring ideas together.
Well, it's a bonding thing, right? It is.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, there are some circumstances in universities, like in a seminar or something, where people might, if belonging is one of the reasons to limit free speech, and you stand up and you're talking about ancient Egypt, and I say, I think this isn't a very good idea at all, and I think your project's not very strong, and you shouldn't come and give another talk because you're just not a strong enough Egyptologist. People might say to me, well, what's the, you've given her, you disturbed her sense of belonging to our community, right? But actually, I might just be doing my job as an academic.
Yeah, and also it's actually like I would recognize that as actually honoring of me, because what it's doing is believing that I have the ability to grow
because you're a scholar, and that is actually a really good point. Again, it comes back to the mission of the university. Academics should feel that their sense of belonging is enhanced when they're participating in the joint mission of the university together with other academics by arguing with their colleagues over ideas, because that's what the university is there to do.
Although it does say in this policy that there is a limit in terms of disparagement, right?
Sure. And I don't have so much of a problem with that. I don't mind if this is different from freedom of expression and the idea of hate speech in the law in general. I don't mind if a university, in fact, I think it's quite desirable for a university to say, we don't think you should use ad hominem as part of the way in which you talk about ideas. You argue about the idea. You don't insult the person who has the idea.
Right.
Having said that, in my training, I was trained by scientists who would kind of abuse one another a bit. I don't think that was desirable, but I do think that you have to have a certain amount of resilience to that kind of thing, and not be too kind of prissy about people saying mean things. But not to say that I think that saying mean things about individuals is desirable at all. And so no problem with that in principle.
Well, it's just... I think it's an esteeming thing, really, to sort of recognize in someone that they have the capacity to, I suppose, engage with the criticism and understand that you're not criticizing them as an individual, but you're engaging with their ideas.
If I'm focusing on your ideas, But for example, if two scholars, say at a think tank, put out, or two scholars along with some academic colleagues, put out an article arguing for institutional neutrality at New Zealand universities for certain reasons, and a New Zealand academic goes on social media and calls them white men and, puts
racist,
bark emojis, that kind of thing, that's clearly not appropriate, right? But I do kind of agree with Michael in the sense that I think there's a little bit of a slippery slope here too, and I would prefer that to be a kind of norm, like a kind of loose social norm at the university, that you kind of lose social points, maybe even professional points, but it's not so much of a hard rule. But that's actually like a very small point. Like, I actually agree that this is what the sentence actually says here is, neither dialogue nor the exchange of ideas is advanced or encouraged by belittling, disparaging, or stigmatizing others. I completely agree with that.
Just a true statement.
It's part of the work we've been doing, like part of the reason we joined Heterodox Academy. Again, I'm always just a little bit worried with the university people that they're going to take stigmatizing in this incredibly broad sense. If someone like a criminologist discusses evidence that there might be that sort of men commit more crimes than women, or certain ethnicities commit more crime, then that will be shut down because it's stigmatizing others. But if it just means like direct insults, ad hominem, not playing the ball rather than the man or the person, then I'm totally behind that part of the policy. Okay, we should go a bit faster because I feel like how long have we gone for? Probably more than an hour. Yeah. Okay. Let's maybe choose like 2 or 3 things we want to talk about just to wrap up. I mean, one thing is a few clauses which they also had in the first version of this free speech policy. The first version of the free speech policy, this was much stronger. And this is the idea that scholars should be guided by their disciplines. In the first version, it was more like you should really only speak about things that are in your professional expertise. Now it has slightly weaker knowledge. It sort of recommends that academics are involved in public debate, informed by their scholarly experience and approach, discipline, and professional experience.
So that I like that, because it's no longer saying you should stay in your lane. It's recognizing that a lot of the time you'll be speaking about your area of expertise, but also that your general scholarly training equips you to speak on all kinds of matters. And I think that's a good thing, because I think academics should not stay in their lanes.
You want to say anything about that?
No, just agree.
Yeah, there's more health and safety stuff there. We're getting to the end, I think. Okay, one thing it says is, as with the previous version, it says that people should be allowed to come onto campus and be hosted and just do talks and speeches and maybe even host debates. It does not incur upon anyone an obligation to listen. I totally agree with that. And I would add that that means if you're really upset by a speaker coming onto campus and speaking, one solution to that is not to come. And to allow other people to go.
To go and eat your lunch in some different part of the university.
So one thing I would add, actually, again, this is a small criticism, but if Victoria University really wants to help free speech and for this policy to be extra good, I would say here, they say, it does not incur upon anyone an obligation to listen or to be invited or to be hosted by the university. I agree with that too. However, there is the phenomenon that is very familiar now in Anglophone university campuses, where they invite somebody and then a small minority of radical students or staff kick off and start protesting. This is what happened even with the Victoria University Free Speech panel, where they invited you, they confirmed the panel, then a small number of students kicked off and said, Jonathan and Michael's words are dangerous and the panel isn't diverse enough. And instead of actually standing firm, Nick Smith reorganized the panel. So I think there should be some kind of statute, maybe not a statute, maybe just some kind of rule of thumb that I know that they've used at some US universities, I think in the UK as well, where they say after a speaker has been confirmed, like there's a series of steps that they go through when the speaker is invited to campus. And after a certain point, when that speaker is confirmed and they've sort of sent the email saying, looking forward to it, then you may not cancel that speech unless for like very serious reasons, like there's a bomb threat or like there's an earthquake that day or something.
Alluding to the kind of like high level of safety that Michael was talking about.
I mean, the other thing,
safety as like actual physical safety.
The other thing to briefly note about visiting speakers is that they only say that staff have the right to invite speakers onto campus, whereas some high-profile cases, including Don Brash being banned from Massey, was the case where a student group had invited someone onto campus, and in that case, Brash. I would note that the Education and Training Act says that students are members of the university and that academic freedom applies to them too. So I see no reason why they shouldn't be included amongst the people who can invite speakers.
Took the words right out of my mouth, to quote Meatloaf.
I'd just like to, if I can, just share another little bit of something that I really liked the phrasing of in this, just in relation to the sort of inviting of speakers. I really like the way they put this, that the activities, that's the visiting speaker, should be consistent with the academic mission of the university, including whether it promotes and enhances scholarly pursuit, facilitates the genuine sharing and or testing of ideas, connects evidence to hypothesis, and or seeks to further understanding.
Yeah, you like that?
I like that they're aiming at scholarly pursuit, and I like that they're aiming at the.
But they should. But I agree that's a good thing. But also, we might point out that politicians, activists, and celebrities are not scholars, and they're not going to meet this kind of standard of evidence. But true. They are influential people, and they're going to be saying things in public that may be contestable and should be contested, and actually inviting them onto campus and not expecting them to meet these standards of scholarship to do so is a productive thing, because it enables others to interrogate their ideas from a scholarly perspective and see whether they stand up.
It's tough because I know what you're saying. I know where you're coming from. Like, I like scholarship too, and I've tried to inculcate scholarly norms in my students, and in debating with people online, like that Auckland professor who basically slandered us. I've tried to get back at her by, replying to that with reason and evidence and encouraging her to use reason and evidence. Having said that, I think that should be seen as a kind of soft norm. And I don't think it should ever be a reason to exclude someone from their natural speech rights. So I agree with Michael. So I had the experience of when I was an undergraduate at Oxford, the Oxford Union was a thing. And people might not understand that Oxford Union isn't an ordinary student union in the sense it's not an advocacy group. It's a debate society, like the Cambridge Union. And it's a debate society, but they also have visiting speakers. And often the visiting speakers would be, intellectuals, and they would be scholars, and they'd be great academics, and they would present themselves in an academic manner. And sometimes they would not be. They would be Pamela Anderson, or they'd be a porn star, or they'd be a sports star, cricketer, right? And as Michael says, I think it would be a bit weird, and I think it actually leaves open some space for university or activists to come and say, this person isn't scholarly enough. We need to deplatform them.
It really does.
Thinking
Yeah.
we don't like their
We don't like their ideas.
Interesting, yeah, because I didn't actually read that into the way that this is phrased, because it seemed to me that covering the genuine the genuine sharing of ideas and seeking to further understanding it kind of,
That's why I said
I guess they didn't read what you were saying into it. So actually, that's interesting. I wonder what they intended when they wrote that, because there's sort of two different reads.
It's hard to know. But I do think that obviously the courses the university runs should be all at a scholarly standard. And so what academics say in their courses when they're giving lectures and tutorials it should meet professional standards of scholarship, because that's what universities are doing with their teaching. But when it comes to invited speakers, I don't think that having a scholarly standard is appropriate at all. I think having bad but influential ideas aired on a university campus where they can be open to debate and dispute is a very good idea.
We can trust people at the university we can't always trust people at the university. What I mean is there are some contexts in the university where I would defend scholarly norms. For example, we used to have a classic seminar, like a departmental seminar. That's
right.
Science faculty have them too, or science programs. And in those, I would only invite people who had some kind of degree in ancient history, or they were postgraduates and they were presenting material which used the right kind of evidence, whether it was archaeological or textual. But of course, there are other parts of campus, maybe they don't have the Oxford Union per se, but there's lots of student groups, and it can be quite anarchic because students are trying to think about things, and that's a wonderful thing.
It's very wonderful.
And sometimes they'll be thinking, let's get this guy to speak to us because he's taken a lot of drugs, and we want to hear from that guy.
Well, I remember when I was at Monash, somebody who'd taken a great many drugs, Timothy Leary, came onto campus. He
was actually a scholar too.
He was a scholar until he became an acid casualty, but he was pretty crazy at the time, but certainly not boring to listen to, and thought-provoking, and a repository of certain kinds of history, as sordid as it may have been by his psychedelic experiences.
I remember we had a Buddhist monk, a Tibetan monk, who came to Oxford. I don't know why he was in Oxford, but he did a talk, and he wasn't a scholar. He wasn't talking about the sutras. He just lived in a cave for, I think it was 3 years. And so everyone was just like, oh my God, this guy's lived in a cave for 3 years. Let's hear what he has to say. He's actually very quiet, but I think it's one of the effects. Anyway, all right, so we've gone for a long time, but
we probably should draw this to a close. But I think we should actually
time for silence.
Just say
you're not going to be silent for 3 years, hopefully, but you're probably going to come back.
I think it's very unlikely that Steph will be silent for 3 years.
Hopefully not.
But I do think we should just finish by saying that we do think that Victoria has improved their policy markedly since the last version, and commend them for that, because we're very quick to criticize and as we should be, we're free speech advocates, but we should also praise things when they get it right. Largely, I think they had we've talked about a few things where we think there still could be further improvement, but well done, VUW.
Yeah, well done. And do I trust them to implement it fairly?
Well, we'll
maybe
see.
Not. Okay. Thank you, Steph, so much for coming in.
Thanks.
Indeed.